Okay, here we are. Let me make sure I am recording. Hold on. Okay. Just wanted to make sure we were rolling there. Okay, so now we are looking at part three, the growth of cities in American culture. And you're going to see an indescribable amount of minutia here, right? Are you going to be okay if you don't know who Jelly Roll Morton is? Yes. Ah, but again, what we're doing here is seeing how everything fits together in the larger picture. Okay. So, an important part, I'm just going straight through, look, three things happened during this time period, 1865 to 1900, that drastically changed the American society. Just as we were talking about how it was amazing, in basically 30 years, the entire West was settled, 35 years, to the point from 1865 to 1900 or 1890, all of a sudden the frontier is closed. Well, during this time period, you have, what are your three big forces? Industrialization, immigration, urbanization, and you have a fast growing industrial urban landscape where you take a city like Chicago in 1893, 3 out of every 4 Chicagoans are first or second generation immigrant, and the same number holds true in New York. So when we talk about causes of immigration, right? Push pull. What's pushing people away from Europe? Poverty, right? No land, very few opportunities, a repressive government, right? Um, and especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, the pogroms that were organized by the state against their Jewish population. So, as Martin Scorsese said in our video, what was in the old country? Oppression and no food. Okay. Um, what attracts people to America? The idea of freedom, political, economic, religious freedom, and a fast growing industrial economy where even though it was terrible, god awful mule work, you had an opportunity to work. Remember, old immigrants are primarily Northern and Western Europeans who have some skills. Most were Protestant. Yes, we have the big wave of Irish Catholics and some German Catholics. Um, but they're generally more educated, had more skills, were not dirt poor coming over, had some English, and a lot were Protestant. New immigrants, there's basically no Protestants, and it's really poor people. I mean, it's people that are destitute that are leaving. Again, the Stanford woman will teach you all about poverty in Europe at this time. I'm just, I'm hoping that you retain something from HWC and remember how fixed land ownership was and how few opportunities there were in the primarily agricultural peasant states of Southern, Central, Eastern Europe. Um, and that's where this demographic is coming from, and it is a great challenge because they are very much outside of the culture of these new American cities where they are coming. The Statue of Liberty, just remember, like we when the Statue of Liberty is built, we have zero restrictions on immigration, other than I think it went up in '83, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigration into America until basically the 1960s. And remember, that came out of one, racism, two, fear of economic competition out in California. Um, these immigration acts, basically, it was for the first time ever, Contract Labor Act was in response to fear of labor competition, and it became harder to bring in somebody as not a permanent resident, but to work for a few years and then go back home. Um, for the most part, though, if you could, you don't have to take an English test until 1917. Um, there's like, for all intents and purposes, there are no restrictions other than the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, you had to get checked. You all seen The Godfather. Vito Corleone gets quarantined because he got TB, right? But um, it really is open immigration. It is met with a lot of resistance because this idea of cultural diversity, like you learned in ninth grade, that cultural mosaic, um, really gives way to, even in some of the best intentioned reformers, to this idea of melting pot, and that there has to be a concerted effort to Americanize everyone that comes over. And there was some legitimate concern, because you had all these people coming from countries that had no experience with like democracy or representative government. And we certainly see how that plays out in the corruption of the political machines. And we learned just how terrible, overcrowded these urban areas were, because rich people left. As you switch from walking cities to streetcar cities, like, rich people moved, middle class people moved, and towards the center of the city were these poorer ethnic neighborhoods. And a lot of people advocated maybe there's a better way, whether it was Henry George, Progress and Poverty, writing about a tax on land to redistribute wealth, or Edward Bellamy with Looking Backwards, which presented sort of like a future utopia. Jane Addams and the settlement houses, which provided, there was no government social services. So it was like, here you can get childcare, here you can get job training, here you can learn English. Here is a gathering place in this poor ethnic neighborhood. You had religious individuals in the cities that preached the Protestant, the social gospel movement. That was Walter Rauschenbusch. The Catholic Church and Cardinal Gibbons that advocated for like labor solidarity and the right of workers to organize for livable wages, or the Dwight Moody. What is he? I think he's Christian Scientist. It's just another example of religious leaders. The Salvation Army is a Christian organization. It's borrowed from England, and it's the idea of these private organizations. Again, we don't have the concept of a responsive state to take care of all of these poor people packed into these tight cities. So it's religious organizations, it's middle-class crusaders, private organizations like the Salvation Army. Other issues, now you're not living on the farm, kids are a liability, we don't have as many kids. States start to liberalize divorce laws, such as for like violence or for like abandonment. So the divorce rate went up. You still have women crusaders, the National Association for Women's Suffrage. The war on alcohol is going. The WCTU has, Women Christian Temperance Union, has 500,000 members. The Anti-Saloon League wants to close down all the saloons. Remember, what was it? Before the 18th Amendment, I think it's 16 states completely closed every bar, because that was the male culture, was to go and drink. You did not drink with women. Carrie Nation was the leading advocate of the Anti-Saloon League, who took a hatchet to whiskey barrels in saloons. You also had a new culture that came out of these cities. There's more leisure time. People are working less. We are getting away from that old puritanical idea of idle hands being the devil's workshop, where it's okay to like allocate time for fun. And if you can be not working and not necessarily sinning. And then, of course, where cities become connected with transportation through trains and through streetcars, you start to see a real rise in leisure activities. Whether it is like traditional music, like John Philip Sousa, you see a big boom. These are guys that jazz, blues, ragtime. With compulsory school, 90% of America is literate, and we have mass circulation. I think it's Pulitzer or Hearst. One of them, the New York World, I think it reaches 1 million. It's the first newspaper to get 1 million subscribers, right? Or women's magazines like Ladies Home Journal, which was only 10 cents. You had all sorts of traveling entertainment, like Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth, or Buffalo Bill putting on a Wild West show. Sports, it's nowhere like today, which is, ridiculous. I mean, where the LA Dodgers have $1 billion TV contract. It's male. It's single male. Women didn't go to sporting events. And like I was telling you, like during this time, if you were a professional athlete, that'd be like a woman being a prostitute, right? It was not a respectable thing to do. Boxing and baseball are big. Rich people played amateur sports, and they didn't let anybody that wasn't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in. It's pretty good. And of course, the primary male activity was still drinking. And I'm a little disappointed that they didn't put gin mill down there. They have pool hall, right? I mean, if you're going to have pool halls, you might as well have gin mills. So that was still a male activity, and sports was very much tied to that all male world, and it was not very reputable. When we talk about cities growing, not only do you have massive influx of immigrants during the late 19th century, but as we talked in the last page, things aren't too good on the farm, and a lot of farm people are moving to the cities. Streetcar cities allowed, again, like it's the idea, everybody kind of used to live in one place because you had to walk to work, but with streetcars now, poor people only stayed close, and the further you got away from like where work was done, was like a sign of wealth. We talked about Carnegie and Steel. Well, now you can build up. What you ended up seeing were in these areas towards the center of the cities where people couldn't leave, like Hell's Kitchen in New York City, just horrific, overcrowded tenements, 400 people living in, 4,000 people living on one city block. I mean, it was terrible. And very, very, very few civic ordinances for it. Again, if you had money, you got away from the middle of the city. And we had this really ineffective, corrupt system of social services where political machines were great because no matter, you could have just gotten off the boat and been dirt poor, but the boss is going to give you whatever you need. If you're on hard times and you need work, he'll find you work. If your apartment burns down, he'll find you a place to stay. But remember, it's unequivocal support. And remember, bosses like Plunkett at Tammany Hall, or McGee in Pittsburgh, or Tweed in Tammany Hall. It was estimated that during Boss Tweed's day, 2/3 of all the money that was supposed to be allocated for city building got stolen by Tammany Hall. Graft, right? We talked a lot about that as there was so much, these cities had grown so big, there was so much money, it was such a big business, there was so much money for people to take. It is a time where we are becoming much more educated. Again, compulsory education, starting as early as kindergarten, developing public high schools that don't just follow the college prep route, but become vocational. And then we have Johns Hopkins. I don't know, it's some weirdo thing like it's kind of like Hoover Elementary School where it's different than the rest. I'm kidding, Hoover had to take a shot at it. But it had a much more creative system of like graduate studies, and then also an opportunity to study more things in college. Good. Professions. Here's the bottom line. People started to look at things much more scientifically, in that it was challenging the status quo, whether it was Clarence Darrow as a lawyer and wanting to see laws updated to represent more modern society, right? Same thing with Holmes, or W.B. Du Bois, who, we'll talk more about in the context of civil rights, but, was a social scientist studying crime. America, writing got real, right? Y'all read Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, who wrote, Sister Carrie and The Red Badge of Courage, very realistic stories. Jack London, Call of the Wild, the realism and harshness in nature. Architecture, we got away from the classical style of trying to imitate the Greeks and Romans. And I can't speak intelligently on this, but we switched to more Romanesque style, in the idea of form following function and organic architecture. We all know Frank Lloyd Wright from Pittsburgh, and with Falling Water, and then Frederick Lloyd Olmsted, who designed Central Park, as that's part of this City Beautiful movement, where it was like originally in the city, like streetcars and everything were all private. And then as cities grew, people realized, well, wait a second, we need the government to run this for the public good. Writing just became more realistic, right? And art became much more realistic as well. Writing about stories that told tales of poverty as it was, or when we come to art getting away from like this romantic idealist portrayal and things that were more realistic. So I think we hit all of the big conceptualizations. Don't worry, you're not going to get bogged down where if you're like, Cardinal Gibbons, give me a break. I think we 10 run them back when we went to North Carolina once, but that's another story. You're going to be okay. It's the big ideas that I reviewed in here that you would need to know for the changes to urban America. All right. Oops, I got to get out of here.